Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with another Blind Gear Shootout. Up until this point on this series, I've mostly focused on amplifier and drive pedal tones, taking the real unit and comparing it to its digital counterparts when recorded in the same manner. Today I'm going to be flipping that premise just a little bit on its head and seeing if you can take the same amplifier sound and record it in different manners, and if you can tell the difference. And if you can tell the difference, which way is best. So we're going to be evaluating a clean tone and a high gain rhythm tone, since those are the two that I mainly deal with and the ones that I'm more personally interested in myself. But before we get to that, this video is brought to you by me. Do you like progressive metal, perhaps even movie scores? 8-string guitars? Then you are bound to enjoy my first EP, Children of the Stars. Performed, programmed, produced, mixed, and approximately mastered by one dork in a spare bedroom, the debut release from the Shootout project is a celebration of all melodic instrumental music. With a smaller art budget than Macaulaywood's Who Killed Captain Alex, this symphonic metal adventure is not afraid to say, F it, let's see what that sounds like. Not literally, of course, there's no lyrics, after all. Get your copy at the link in the video description. This video was inspired by some of the, I guess you could call it R&D work that I've been doing over the past few months in preparation for recording some of the upcoming projects I have in the pipeline. Still very much tweaking the sound, tweaking guitar tones and the overall mix in general, but I'm kind of getting up and ready for that. But with the Shootout EP that I just released, I wasn't necessarily concerned about getting the most realistic guitar tone. Everything else was sampled anyway, sampled drums, sampled instruments. But for guitar and bass, I wanted to have a sound that I could replicate with physical gear if I had to, but I wasn't necessarily concerned about it sounding exactly like another one of my amps, although I ended up using Mesa Mark series and Rectifier series amps on that. But overall, it's a sound that I'm happy with, but I wasn't necessarily shooting for like the real deal. For this upcoming project and looking like projects, I absolutely want that amp, chuck a mic up to the speaker, crank it up to 11 kind of sound. And with that, I was, I started worrying and second guessing a bit of my own advice, thinking, I've been recommending impulse responses and all these direct tones because I think they sound great. But is there a difference? Is there something to this madness of some bands still wanting to go through all this trouble and isolate cabinets and route 15 different microphones and all these snake cables and all this crap? Is that worth it? Is there really a discernible difference? So before I, go and actually record all this stuff, I wanted to find out for myself if you can tell. So without giving too much information away up front, what you'll be hearing is either a fully analog thing at the source, at least it all gets turned to digital at the end when it's, sampled in a digital workstation, or a fully digital thing at the source, or something in between that mixes and matches elements of both. Likewise, the samples you'll hear, there'll be 6 of them for each clean and high gain, they will correspond to the same number of its opposing sound. So clean 1 is the same setup as high gain 1 in the same way that clean 6 is the same setup as high gain 6. So if you hear particular differences in them, maybe you can look at the number and figure out which one is which, but I highly doubt it. And you'll hear why in a moment. So let's take a listen to each of those samples before I tell you what the experiment setup was. Let me just say that it's been a better part of, a month now since I actually shot these, and I'm just now getting to this video and editing those stems, going back, listening to them without the titles. I had no idea what I was listening to. It was really tough to even work with this material again, especially with the cleans, because I could have used any of those. I would have processed them the same, and they're fine. For the high gain sounds, I certainly have my preferences, but even the ones that I wouldn't necessarily use in a recording, those setups still have their place, even if it's not for recorded guitar. So I think there's going to be some interesting revelations coming out of this. So let's talk about the experiment setup. The most simple way to look at this is basically a 3x2 test matrix, where we have two separate amplifier sounds being routed through three cabinet sounds. It's not quite that cut and dry, but you'll see what I'm talking about when we get into the details. So let's start with our most analog sample here. So starting with the Mesa Boogie Mark IV amp head plugged directly into the oversized Mesa rectifier cabinet. So that's, tube power amp going directly to 4 speakers. And then the upper right most V30 speaker was mic'd up with this cam crystal mic, which is basically a Neumann clone. I chose this because I don't have another dynamic nor condenser mic, especially that sounds like this, and it'd be hardest to fake with other impulse responses because, you got like U67s, U87s, that kind of thing. But this has a very distinct sound. And so I think if there's going to be a case where you would want to mic up a cabinet, it'd be when you have a very unusual mic sound. So if I can replicate this in other means, then there's a pretty good case that you could do it as well. So that's the most traditional setup. On the other end of the spectrum, the most digital setup would be the Fractal AX8 using the USA lead model, which is its model of the Mesa Mark IV lead channel, going into an impulse response that I made of that exact cabinet setup. Those are the two most dissimilar configurations, so let's talk about the ones in between, and you might even be piecing this puzzle together based on those two use cases alone. So another way I recorded the real Mesa Mark IV is to stick it through a 2-notes captor load box, which simulates the reactivity of a real speaker cabinet, and then put that through that same impulse response that I shot. So we're mixing a digital cabinet of sorts with the real analog amp that thinks it's going through a cabinet. So this is a way to record your real tube amps at a direct level in the, no volume in the room. You can do this completely silently. And so you could take advantage of a nice amp collection without having to, bust your eardrums. As a complete mirror to that setup, I also routed the AX8 through the effects return of the Mark IV to use its power amp, which was still connected to the oversized rectifier cabinet and mic'd up with the cam crystal. So now we're using a digital preamp and a analog physical power amp and speaker cabinet and microphone setup. So this is kind of a cool setup if you want to use pre and post effects around a preamp and still use something to make it loud, which is a cool gigging and touring setup. As a result, I did disable the power amp modeling in the AX8 since this already has a real tube power amp. Now the other two use cases, still out loud in the room mic'd up cabinets, but instead of using the tube power amp, we're using the GT1000 effects by Matrix, which is a solid state amp. Although it's mostly advertised as being a good pairing for sophisticated amp modelers like the Axe Effects or non-powered Kempers, and it does a great job at that. It also works with any direct line level signal you throw at it. In this case, putting a real amplifier signal through a load box and then taking that DI out and putting it through the matrix. Now in this case, it's pretty redundant. We already have a tube power amp here, but this does have a couple advantages. One, we can attenuate the output signal if we want, so we can crank the power amp without, blowing our eardrums and making it excessively loud. But it's also a good setup if you want to use post effects, especially in like a wet, dry, wet case. So if you wanted to have a stereo delay or modulation effects, you could use either one stereo cabinet, two mono cabinets, feed those signals through the power amp, and you still have tube coloration without needing a separate tube power amp. So that's a cool setup. And the Matrix is also advertised as kind of having tube qualities. It doesn't necessarily sound like it. It doesn't react the same way, but it is a class A/B thing that I find sounds really nice with anything that already has a power amp EQ curve baked in. And that's the same thing with the AX8. So I also ran the full AX8 model through the Matrix and put it through the speaker cabinet. That leaves us with a total of 3 pairs of configurations, one of which is a totally direct solution. One is a cabinet powered by a tube power amp, and the last is another cabinet powered by a solid state power amp. The only difference within them being it's either a real amplifier totally or a digital recreation of that amplifier. So let's have a listen and I'll show you which one was which. Like many of these videos, the results were simultaneously relieving and surprising, sort of. I don't know why I continue to be surprised by this kind of stuff. I do this every time, and I'm shocked that I can't tell the difference between the analog and digital gear, but here we are again. For the clean tones, they're all perfect as far as I'm concerned. I could not tell you the difference between the impulse response between the real amp, the AX8 interpretation of it. So if anything, number one, kudos to Fractal for nailing the Mark IV clean channel, though clean amps are far easier to profile and recreate. Even the pod sounded okay. But yeah, I would have taken any of those, but for the sake of pure convenience for my clean sounds, amp modeler is fine. Actually, it's the best. If you want some feedback or simply, just have a particular clean amp you want to use, then, I think the direct route is great as well. Using an impulse response and I don't really see any need to mic up a speaker cabinet for clean amps unless your tones highly rely on both the master volume being cranked and a lot of speaker compression from, being driven really hard. That particular parameter, though, is modeled on AXFX firmware, even on AXFX 2, so it's going to be especially good on AXFX 3. So I really don't see a reason to be cranking the volume on a clean amp unless you just have this very specialized setup that can't be replicated, and that's becoming less and less common, but maybe it happens. For me, for the sounds I'm going after, there's no need to mic up a cabinet for these clean tones. The high gain test is where these differences start to come out a lot more prominently, which isn't surprising to me. My ear is far more sensitive to these kind of sounds than they are to clean tones. Fortunately, the ones that I liked the least are the ones that I would never record with anyway, so it turned out great. So number one, with the AX8 going through the Matrix Power Amp, that's not really a use case that I would ever take advantage of for recording. It makes no sense. You already have a device that does direct. Why would you send it through a power amp just to put it through a microphone to go back into your interface? It's very convoluted. What is good about that setup is being able to have stage sound in a live environment if you want to do that. So, you could send an effects out block and then put it through there and still have XLR outs or SPDIF, whatever you're using, to go directly to the front of house. That's the cool setup. Furthermore, I found the AX8 through the Matrix Power Amp to be the most artificial sounding of the bunch. It wasn't bad or unusable, but it's a hell of a lot of effort to get a sound that isn't even the best that piece of equipment can do. So I say, use that for in the room applications or on stage because it sounds great in that way. But for, recording, it just doesn't make any sense. Kind of the similar deal with the real amp head through the Matrix. I do find it to be better, and it's one that I enjoy jamming through a lot. It is more even tempered, at least in the case of this amp model. It is more defined in both the low end and high end of the frequency spectrum, but it doesn't quite hold up the same as putting it through the power amp, or at least the actual tube power amp of this amp head. So again, I wouldn't record that way, but for wet, dry, wet, and especially lead tones, then that could be a very usable use case for, again, in the room and on stage applications. For me, I'd rather just put it through an impulse response and then go through the rest of my pedal board if I want to go that route. Oddly enough, routing the AX8 through the tube effects return sounded almost identical to this amp directly through the solid state Matrix. Not sure how that worked out, but it did. And again, I can't really recommend anyone do that setup. It's fine for stage volume, in the room jamming, band practice, cool, I get it. But number one, I trust Fractal's amp models to have a power amp section that complements the preamp perfectly, whereas with outboard tube power amps, you never know. It might be perfect, but if you are using an amp model that is really dependent on tube power amp breakup, then you can't always do that at a reasonable volume level with outboard gear. So for me, if you've already got something that does direct that well, just stick with it. Screw all this miking cabs up and that kind of stuff, unless you are playing in a venue, and then you can, split your signal and have stage volume and a direct out as well. And that brings me to my top 3 picks for the high gain examples, which works out since these are the ones that I would actually do, with my third pick being the real amplifier stack of all things. Funny, it's not on top, but put an 85 watt tube head through V30 speakers. I mean, it sounds good. Of course it does. It's a great amplifier, very suitable cabinet, and a microphone I like a lot. The disadvantages being that it's fairly loud. I don't have the power amp that loud, and I never really do for my recorded tones, at least when it comes to high gain stuff, but it's still cumbersome, and it's still something that a lot of people won't be allowed to do because they live in some sort of suburb or an apartment complex that you're not going to get by with that crap. But either way, it sounded good. I would record with it. There are elements of that sound that you have to definitely tweak and compensate for. You can hear some high-end fizz. You can hear some of the scooped frequencies that you might want to accentuate a bit more. So you'll probably have to do some tweaking to get it to sit in a mix right, but it's the classic rock and roll guitar sound. So yeah, it's good. My second favorite is the AX8 completely direct, which is awesome because it's without a doubt the easiest way to record guitar. You just, pull up your preset, plug a guitar in, you're ready to go. Tweaking did not take me that long to get it to sound as close as I did there once I had the impulse response made. So once again, great job to Fractal on getting these amp models so close. Mine is a bit more fizzy. It does have more high frequency content. I find the graphic EQ may not sound exactly the same, but these are all things that frankly you would run into with other real amp heads anyway. So I'm more likely to view the Fractal models as just more amps. It's just like having a second Mark IV that doesn't sound exactly like this one. It's not like I view it as oh, this is a digital thing. No, it's just another library of amplifiers. So it's very nice to know that, number one, I can get that same sort of sound directly if I want, or if I want just a slight variation of what I already have, then I can view it as that as well. So that's awesome. And then my absolute favorite was the amp head going through the impulse response, which again is great because that's the way I love to record these things. It's easy. It's, no volume involved besides whatever you're monitoring with. And the best part about it to me is if you're not happy with the cabinet sound, you can recab. You can always throw on a different impulse response, and that will minimize your EQing. That will change up your sound in ways that simply adjusting EQ on an amp isn't going to do. And you can kind of reamp or record all sorts of things without having to worry about tweaking this so much. Just kind of find a good sound, stick with it, and then you can always change your cab IR later. Now, here's my dirty little secret about the impulse response. That wasn't even technically a real IR. That was an EQ match that was made into an impulse response. So a lot of the airiness that you get with some IRs wasn't even there. I just turned up the room parameter in that IR to 10% to kind of get some of that, and I couldn't even tell the difference between a real cab. So you don't even need a real IR per se. You could just have a EQ match program and pretty much match whatever recording sound you want, and you're done. I mean, it sounds that good. However, I did test this with plenty of other IRs, and I still preferred it to the real cab because, again, it is less fizzy. It does get rid of some of those elements of miking up a cabinet that don't sound so nice, even though when you shoot the IR, it should be the exact same thing. Rarely is that the case, especially if you're using a different power amp and all that stuff. So what I took away from all this is basically for cleans, I don't care. I'm just going to get a good clean sound and not worry about how I record it. I will definitely be leaning towards the real amp routes for these upcoming projects just because I like the sounds I'm getting out of them. But that's really the only reason. It's not because I have some fetish when it comes to tubes. For high gain stuff, I do prefer the idea of an analog drive pedal going into an analog amp, but this pretty much proved to me it just does not matter. And I absolutely have no reservations about putting an amp head through impulse responses anymore. Not that I had much of one beforehand, but there's always this voice in the back of my head saying there's something missing, There's all these critics about impulse responses in general saying, well, it ain't the real thing. It's missing too many dynamics or too many non-linear things that impulse responses don't cover. And that might be true. But number one, I feel you can model a lot of that in an amp block like Fractal does. And number two, if it sounds worse than the impulse response anyway, then I don't care. I'm just going to use that IR. So in all this stuff that I'm making that's sample heavy and a blend of analog and digital gear, I'm completely happy with this. So yeah, digital amp modelers and load boxes paired with high gain amps is a freaking awesome way to go. And it's a way I'm probably going to stick with my recordings for the foreseeable future. I cannot see myself miking up a cabinet, reamping, quad track guitars for hours on end, especially if I do a full length album. It's just not going to happen. It's not worth my time. So I hope you found that as interesting as I did. I'm sure this will be confirmation bias for some people that bought their shiny toys, and for others maybe might be a touch of regret in there. But there's a lot of ways to get a good guitar sound, and I showed it here. Didn't cover VST plugins, but with stuff like Reaxis, as far as the Mark Series amp goes, or like the Poulin Lecto for the rectifier. In those blind shootouts, they sounded practically identical too. So in the right use case, the gear really doesn't matter all that much as long as it's within a similar class of quality. You can get a good sound. So that's it for me. Thanks for watching. Any questions and comments, as always, please leave them down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye.